On June 23, 1942, Royal Air Force spotters at Pembrey Airfield in South Wales watched in confusion as a sleek German fighter descended through the clouds and lined up for landing. Sirens should have been wailing, and anti-aircraft guns should have been ready to fire, but something about the aircraft's approach didn't seem hostile. The Focke-Wulf 190 touched down smoothly on the grass runway and rolled to a stop near the control tower. Its engine shut off, the canopy slid open, and Oberleutnant Armin Faber of Jagdgeschwader 2 climbed out of his cockpit, removed his leather helmet, and looked around at the strange surroundings. Then, suddenly, the truth hit him. The aircraft parked along the flight line weren't Messerschmitts, they were Spitfires. The men running toward him weren't wearing Luftwaffe gray, they were dressed in Royal Air Force blue. Faber's stomach dropped as he realized the scale of his mistake. In the same instant, British intelligence officers across southern England were grasping what had just happened. Germany's most advanced fighter, the mysterious new aircraft that had dominated Allied skies for months, had just landed in Britain completely intact. The intelligence windfall was enormous. The fearsome Focke-Wulf 190, which had been cutting down Allied pilots with ruthless efficiency, was now sitting undamaged on an RAF runway. What American and British engineers would learn from that captured fighter would go on to change how every Allied pilot engaged German aircraft for the rest of the war. For 8 months, the FW-190 had been the terror of the skies. It first appeared over France in September 1941, and from its debut engagement, it was clear the Allies were facing something extraordinary. Squadron leader J.E. Johnny Johnson, who would later become Britain's top-scoring ace, met the FW-190 in early 1942 and barely escaped alive. It was faster than our Spitfire Mark V's in level flight and in a dive, Johnson later wrote. It could outroll us, and its firepower was devastating. For the first time in the war, our fighters were completely outclassed. The numbers backed up the fear. In the first half of 1942, Royal Air Force losses over France spiked dramatically. Veteran pilots who had survived the Battle of Britain were being shot down by this new German aircraft that no one seemed able to counter. The FW-190 could dive away from pursuing Spitfires, outroll them in a turning fight, and obliterate them with its 420mm cannon firing high-explosive shells. When American pilots began arriving in Britain with their new P-47 Thunderbolts, they heard the same grim warnings. Don't try to turn with a 190. Don't try to outroll it. Don't chase it in a dive. The list of what not to do was long. The list of what might work was vanishingly short. Allied intelligence desperately needed to understand the secret of this aircraft, its strengths, its weaknesses, and how to counter it. But every FW-190 shot down in Britain had been too badly damaged to provide meaningful data. Then Armin Faber made his catastrophic error. Faber was no rookie. At just 21, he was already a decorated ace with several victories and a respected member of Jagdgeschwader 2, the elite Richthofen fighter wing. On June 23, 1942, he flew a routine fighter sweep over the English Channel, providing top cover for German bombers striking targets along the coast. The mission went smoothly until the return leg, when he became engaged in a fierce dogfight with British fighters. During the chaotic maneuvers above the clouds, Faber became disoriented. The overcast obscured the coastline, and the sun's position misled his sense of direction. When he broke through the clouds and spotted a green countryside with a familiar-looking airfield below, he made a fatal assumption. He believed he was over France, approaching a friendly Luftwaffe base. In reality, he was over Wales, lining up on RAF Pembrey. In hindsight, the mistake seems impossible, but disorientation in combat was more common than most air forces admitted. At high speed and under intense G-forces, pilots could easily lose all sense of direction. Spobber had unknowingly turned 180 degrees during the fight and never realized it. He landed smoothly, unaware of the danger, until he noticed the wrong aircraft on the field. In a panic, he tried to restart his engine and take off again, but it was too late. RAF ground crews were already surrounding him. Within minutes, he was in custody, and Britain had in its possession a perfectly preserved Focke-Wulf 190A. The reaction at RAF headquarters bordered on elation. Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas, commander of Fighter Command, immediately ordered the plane transported to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough for full analysis. Every component was to be studied, every dimension measured, every capability tested. Within 48 hours, the FW-190 was at Farnborough, surrounded by Britain's top aviation engineers, men who understood they were about to unlock the secrets of Germany's most formidable weapon. What Allied engineers uncovered in the captured Focke-Wulf 190 explained every terrifying story that had been coming back from the front. The aircraft was a masterpiece of practical wartime engineering. If the Spitfire was a symbol of elegant aerodynamics, the FW-190 was pure, brutal efficiency. Its BMW 801 radial engine produced 1,700 horsepower, far more than the Spitfire Mark V's 1,470. But raw power wasn't what made it deadly. The FW-190's greatest advantage lay in its roll rate. It could snap from one bank to the other faster than any Allied fighter, and that seemingly minor edge changed the entire nature of aerial combat. When a Spitfire tried to follow a 190 through a series of rolling turns, it simply couldn't keep up. The German pilot could reverse direction almost instantly, gaining position and lining up a shot before the British pilot had time to react. British test pilot Captain Eric Winkle-Brown, who flew the captured aircraft extensively, immediately understood why Allied squadrons had been suffering such heavy losses. "The ailerons are light and responsive at every speed," he wrote. "You can throw this aircraft around the sky with almost no effort." The Spitfire required strength and finesse. The FW-190, he said, responded to thought. The firepower was just as astonishing too. The FW-190A3 carried four 20mm MG-151 cannons and two 7.92mm machine guns. A 2-second burst unleashed more explosive power than a Spitfire Mark V could produce in 10 seconds of continuous fire. All the guns were mounted close to the fuselage, concentrating their fire into a devastatingly tight pattern that ripped apart anything in its sights. Its dive performance also explained how German pilots consistently escaped pursuit. The FW-190's heavier weight and clean aerodynamic design allowed it to dive faster than any RAF fighter. Spitfire pilots who tried to follow found themselves watching helplessly as the German aircraft simply pulled away. But the Farnborough tests also revealed weaknesses, and these turned out to be pure gold for Allied tacticians. The FW-190's powerful radial engine had a serious drawback: cooling problems at high altitude. Above 20,000 feet, its performance dropped sharply. The engine struggled in the thin air, losing power and overheating. The Spitfire's Merlin engine, by contrast, thrived at those altitudes. The same weight that made the FW-190 such a stable diver also made it sluggish in sustained turning combat. It could outroll a Spitfire, but not outturn it. If an Allied pilot could force the fight into a long, horizontal turn, the advantage shifted back to the RAF. Even more critically, American engineers found that the FW-190's controls became extremely heavy at high speeds. In a dive past 400 miles per hour, the pilot needed enormous physical strength to pull out, creating a brief but exploitable window of vulnerability. If Allied fighters could stay with a 190 long enough to catch it during that pullout, when the German pilot was fighting both G-forces and his own controls, they had a chance to strike. Armed with this intelligence, British command immediately issued tactical bulletins to RAF squadrons. But they went one step further. they invited American pilots to test the captured aircraft themselves. In August 1942, U.S. Army Air Forces officers arrived at Farnborough to study Germany's fearsome new fighter. Among them was Major Cass Huff, who was one of the first Americans to fly the FW-190. His report was circulated to every fighter group preparing for deployment to Europe. It was blunt, practical, and life-saving. The FW-190 will beat any Allied fighter below 20,000 feet if the German pilot knows his job. Our advantage is altitude. Above 25,000 feet, our P-47s and late-model Spitfires have the edge. Force them high and we win. Let them dictate low-altitude combat and we die. That single line of intelligence reshaped American air tactics over Europe. When P-47 Thunderbolt units began flying in 1943, their doctrine emphasized high-altitude combat. Bomber escorts stayed at maximum height. Fighter sweeps operated above 25,000 feet whenever possible. When German fighters rose to intercept, the Americans climbed higher still, forcing the FW-190s into thin air where their engines faltered. The captured Focke-Wulf didn't just change tactics, it influenced aircraft design itself, steering American engineers toward new ideas that would define air combat for the rest of the war. At Wright Field in the United States, engineers examined every detail of the captured Focke-Wulf 190. They were especially fascinated by its lightning-fast roll rate and began experimenting with modifications to the ailerons of the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang to make them more responsive. The placement of the FW-190's guns close to the fuselage for maximum concentration of fire also influenced American weapons design. Even the cockpit layout, which German engineers had arranged with combat efficiency in mind, left an impression on U.S. designers developing next-generation fighters. But perhaps the most important revelation wasn't about design at all. It was the realization that the FW-190, for all its brilliance, wasn't invincible. It was a superb aircraft with unique strengths, but also clear weaknesses that could be exploited. The psychological impact of that discovery was enormous. Allied pilots who had once viewed the 190 as unbeatable suddenly had concrete tactics for countering it and proof that it could be defeated. By late 1943, the balance of power in the skies had shifted dramatically. American P-47s and P-51s were now engaging FW-190s at high altitudes where Allied fighters held the advantage. The RAF's upgraded Spitfire Mk9, powered by the new Merlin 61 engine, could finally match the FW-190's speed and climb across most altitude bands. Pilots on both sides understood they were flying machines optimized for different conditions, but the Allies had learned to fight on their own terms. Kill ratios began to tilt in the Allies' favor. FW-190 losses mounted as American and British pilots applied the lessons learned from Faber's captured aircraft. German aces took notice. Oberleutnant Josef Pips Priller, one of the Luftwaffe's most respected FW-190 pilots, wrote in his combat journal in late 1943, "The Americans have studied our aircraft. They no longer fall for the rolling scissors. They force us high where our engines labor. They have learned." The original FW-190 that Faber had mistakenly delivered to the enemy remained at Farnborough throughout the war. It became a vital reference point as new variants appeared. When the FW-190 D9 Dora, equipped with an inline engine, was introduced in late 1944, Allied engineers immediately compared it to the captured aircraft. From those comparisons, they quickly deduced that the Dora's design changes were meant to overcome the original model's high-altitude weaknesses. After the war, aviation historians calculated the extraordinary impact of Faber's blunder. The intelligence obtained from that single aircraft was disseminated across the Allied air forces through tactical manuals, training films, and demonstration flights. It shaped aircraft development, refined pilot training, and transformed aerial strategy across the European theater. Captain Eric Brown, who would go on to fly more captured enemy aircraft than any other Allied pilot, later summed it up perfectly. Faber's navigational mistake gave us the Rosetta Stone for understanding German fighter design. Every strength of the FW-190 was analyzed, every weakness exploited. That one airplane probably saved more Allied lives than any other intelligence coup of the war. The irony was not lost on the Luftwaffe once they learned the full story. One German officer admitted ruefully, "We spent months trying to capture a Spitfire Mk9 intact so we could study it. The British didn't have to try. We delivered our best fighter straight into their hands." Armin Faber survived the war and eventually returned to Germany, where he lived until 1976. According to Luftwaffe records, he was initially blamed for the loss of the aircraft, a humiliating mistake that had handed one of Germany's most secret weapons to the enemy. But later evaluations softened the judgment. Investigators acknowledged that spatial disorientation in combat could happen to even the most experienced pilots, especially amid clouds, high G-forces, and constant maneuvering. The real question wasn't why Faber made his error, but why German intelligence had assumed the British would never get their hands on an intact FW-190. The story of Faber's captured fighter remains one of the most revealing lessons in the history of air warfare. When the Focke-Wulf 190 appeared in 1941, it represented a stunning leap forward in aircraft design, a blend of innovation, power, and agility that outclassed everything the Allies had in the air. For nearly a year, it ruled the skies through superior engineering and unmatched performance. But that dominance disappeared almost overnight the moment Allied engineers were able to study one up close. Once the RAF had Faber's aircraft in its hangars, the invincible FW-190 became a known quantity. Its secrets were exposed, its strengths and weaknesses documented, and its mystique shattered. Every aircraft design is a series of compromises, and the FW-190 was no exception. Its low-altitude power came at the expense of high-altitude performance. Its lightning-fast roll rate was offset by heavy control forces at high speeds. Its formidable firepower added weight that reduced maneuverability. Once Allied pilots understood these trade-offs, they could use them to their advantage, and they did. Today, the FW-190 is still celebrated as one of the finest fighter designs of World War II. Restored examples stand proudly in aviation museums as testaments to German engineering skill. Yet the aircraft's legacy is forever tied to the extraordinary intelligence windfall that revealed its secrets to the world. In the delicate equation of wartime advantage, a single pilot's momentary disorientation over the English Channel turned Germany's top secret into an Allied blueprint. The FW-190 that Armin Faber mistakenly delivered to the British became the aircraft that taught them how to win. The lesson endures far beyond that moment in 1942. Technological superiority is important, but intelligence is decisive. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from brilliant strategies or devastating attacks, but from one simple mistake that hands your enemy exactly what they need. Had Faber not landed that day, the Focke-Wulf 190 might have remained a deadly mystery, an unseen terror that continued to dominate Allied skies through fear as much as performance. Instead, it became a teaching tool. Every Allied pilot studied it, learned from it, and ultimately overcame it. One navigational error, One captured fighter, one stroke of unimaginable luck that transformed the course of the air war over Europe. That's how the Allies got Germany's secret weapon and how one simple mistake helped shift the balance of power in the skies.